Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Kristen Booth from the Weinberg Group, and I will be moderating this presentation titled, Taking Advantage of the Orphan Drug Act. The Weinberg Group is a leading food and drug consultancy with headquarters in Washington, D.C., as well as an office in San Francisco. The speaker on today's webinar is Marla Scarola, a senior consultant at the Weinberg Group. Ms. Scarola earned her master's in biotech at Johns Hopkins University, and during her time at the Weinberg Group has assisted in the development of countless regulatory strategies, as well as the preparation of the QA of regulatory submissions in both the US and EU. During the course of today's presentation, you will be able to submit questions to be answered by Ms. Scarola at the end of the presentation. We will try to get as many questions as possible answered today. However, if we can't get to all of them, we will email the answers along with a copy of the slides to you within a week of the presentation. With that, we will begin the webinar.
Today's webinar, I plan to cover some of the basics of the Orphan Drug Act. So we'll talk about what types of drugs are eligible, what some of the benefits are. I'm also going to go into some specifics about how you file an orphan drug designation request. Then I'll talk about the approval criteria for orphan products and how they compare to your more traditional products, your non-orphan products. I'll raise some of the challenges that companies should be aware of, or some of the nuances at least, when considering an orphan drug pathway. And then lastly, I'll just briefly mention a couple of other programs that are available for rare diseases or conditions. The Orphan Drug Act was enacted in 1983. The intention was to create incentives for sponsors to pursue development of products that will help only a small population of patients. So while it's called the Orphan Drug Act, the program actually applies to not only small molecules, but also biologics. And the orphan terminology derives from the many drugs that were known to be potentially effective for rare diseases, but had been essentially abandoned during development for the lack of profitability. So this situation led to a lot of frustrated patients and caregivers who could look in the published literature and find that there are certain drugs that really had shown promise as treatment for rare diseases, but they were no longer being pursued by any pharmaceutical companies. So how many orphans are out there? In the United States, there are as many as 7,000 rare diseases in total, and they afflict anywhere from 25 to 30 million Americans. So that comes out to more than 1 in every 10 Americans. So while each individual disease may affect few people, many people really do suffer if orphan drugs in general are not being developed. And this was the case before the Orphan Drug Act was enacted. So you can see in this figure, before 1983, there were only 10 drugs for rare conditions approved. But then once the Orphan Drug Act came into place and was implemented, the number of designations has now reached almost 3,000. And as of the end of 2013, so the end of last year, 457 products had been approved. This slide shows the worldwide orphan designations. The number, you were looking at EU, US, and Japan. So based on the successes of the US program, some other regulatory agencies worldwide now also offer these orphan drug programs. So this slide is showing the number of orphan designations per year, and you can see the US in blue, the EU in red, and Japan is in green. And the increase over time is especially dramatic when you look at the United States and Europe in the last decade or so. So why consider pursuing an orphan drug? The Orphan Drug Act provides a number of key incentives to sponsors to facilitate the development of treatments for rare diseases. The first is the 7 years of marketing exclusivity. During this 7 years, the FDA will not approve the same drug for the same orphan indication. And we'll go into a bit more detail later on in the presentation about what FDA really means when they say the same drug in the context of orphans, and also talk about some ways that competitors can potentially get around this policy. The FDA also offers protocol assistance. The responsibility for providing advice on orphan drug protocols rests with whatever review division you're working with, whatever category your drug falls into, you'll be working with that review division. However, the Office of Orphan Product Development acts as an advocate for the sponsor by monitoring the protocol review and acting to resolve any issues that may arise. Sponsors can also take advantage of a tax credit, and this covers up to 50% clinical trial costs. The credit can be applied to federal taxes that were incurred in the prior year, so prior to approval, or you can hold on to it and then use it against future taxes for anywhere up to 20 years. It is important to note that the credit does not apply to testing that is done outside of the United States. And the only way around that is if you can prove that the available testing population in the United States is insufficient, and so you've had to branch out and go into other regions of the world to be able to get sufficient numbers of patients to study. The FDA also offers research grants to help fund the clinical investigations for orphan products, although you don't actually have to have the orphan designation at the time you apply for and receive the grant. So they're focused on rare diseases, but the designation doesn't have to be in place before you get those grants. And the grants are meant for studies that are being conducted under an active IND, and they must be providing data that will advance the product toward market approval. The funding each year is dependent on congressional appropriations, so it can fluctuate a bit. Early in the program's history, the funding rarely exceeded $2 million. But the current annual budget is now about $14 million, so it has grown over time. The grants are generally given, they last 3 to 4 years, and usually there's anywhere from 60 to 85 grants that are funded at any given time. And the last incentive, orphan products are also waived from having to pay the PDUFA application fee. And this is really a substantial savings considering that in 2014, so currently the fee for an application with clinical data is now nearly $2.2 million. So now you're probably thinking, well, this all sounds great, so where do I sign up? I want to take advantage of these incentives. But so first you have to figure out whether your product and your indication is eligible for orphan status. So to determine whether an indication would be considered orphan, you have to determine the size of the affected population. The disease or condition needs to impact fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. Drugs can still qualify for orphan status if the indication affects more than 200,000 people, but in those cases, the applicant has to show that you won't be able to recoup the costs associated with research and development of the product within the first 7 years following FDA approval. And that option is very rarely used. Usually people just go in based on the prevalence estimate. The option with recouping the cost of investment is just really difficult to prove, so it's just rarely used. When evaluating whether your proposed indication affects fewer than 200,000 people, there are a few key considerations that need to be made. The first is whether it's an acute or a chronic condition. So if it's an acute condition, something like malaria, you're going to want to determine the incidence. But if instead you're focused on a chronic condition, and this is where the majority of orphan indications fall into this group of chronic indications, then you're going to need to count everyone who has the disease at any given point in time. And you can use a variety of sources to justify your prevalence estimate. Typically, the data can be found in the published literature, or there may be certain registries or databases that track the prevalence of the condition. If there are no good data available to you, sort of as a last resort, an option is to get 3 independent expert opinions, and those can be submitted as justification. But like I said, that really should be seen as a last resort. When you're reviewing sort of all of these different data estimates provided in the literature or the databases or whatever, you're going to likely end up with a range of estimates. They're all not going to be the same, obviously, and it's the upper end of that range that matters. So it's not just the average, you can't take the middle point. If the upper end of the range exceeds 200,000, then you won't qualify for orphan designation. If the disease or condition is common, orphan designation can still actually be granted if the drug is only for use in a certain subset of the diseased population. So for example, the drug may treat a certain cancer, but it's only effective in patients with a specific genetic mutation. Or another way to think about it is if the toxicity of the product is too high to be tolerated in the broader patient population, but it is reasonable for a subset of patients that are suffering from more severe disease, so that higher toxicity would be tolerated. You want to keep in mind that this subset needs to be medically plausible. So you can't just salami slice the population, as it's referred to, meaning sort of cut it up just to create a small enough subset to qualify for orphan designation. There has to be a good medical reason for why you're considering that population to be distinct. So you're going to need to provide some type of evidence that demonstrates why your product would not be useful in the broad population. So again, this could be based on toxicity or the specific mechanism of action or just your clinical experience in what population the product works best in. As I said, when the FDA grants market exclusivity for an orphan drug, that means they will not approve the same drug for the same indication for 7 years. So whether two drugs are different is determined entirely by the active moiety. So two different salt forms of the same active ingredient are considered to be the same, as are two peptides with only minor changes in amino acid composition. So this is a little different from other areas of FDA in considering whether two drugs are the same. There can be more differences between two drugs, and the orphan office will consider them to be the same. Even if another orphan product considered to be the same as yours has already received market approval for the same indication you're seeking, you may still be eligible for approval and the benefits afforded to orphan products. So this can occur on the basis of clinical superiority to the product already on the market. And this is the loophole of sorts that I was referring to when I said that generally the market exclusivity will prevent the same drug for the same indication from being approved. So the superiority can be based on efficacy or safety, or it can be based on the product providing a major contribution to patient care. In this latter case, the improvement in patient care cannot be accompanied by a loss in efficacy or safety. So you have to be at least as effective and at least as safe as the currently approved product, and then you also have to add on top of that some major contribution to patient care. So some examples of what would be considered major contributions to patient care would include changes in your formulation, like changing from an injection to an oral product, or decreasing the frequency of dosing, but more along the lines of going from maybe a once per day dose to a once per month dose. Going just from like a 3 times per day to a once per day is likely not enough of a change to be considered a major contribution. In the case where a drug has already been approved for an orphan indication, subsequent drugs with the same active moiety may be granted an orphan designation on the basis of a plausible hypothesis of clinical superiority. But to obtain approval for the same indication and orphan benefits, the clinical superiority to the approved drug needs to actually be demonstrated in the eventual marketing application, so in the NDA or BLA. So it's not clear yet whether this means you have to conduct head-to-head clinical trials. There is this added burden beyond merely showing efficacy and safety for the orphan product. So this may mean that comparison to placebo in clinical trials is not enough, and an active comparator will need to be included in your trials. So what do you actually need to include in this application? In general, there are 2 sort of major elements. You need to demonstrate plausibility for the drug's expected benefit. So this could be based on clinical data or even animal studies or in vitro data that show sort of the mechanism of action, proof of concept kind of things. So typically applications with clinical data are more successful, but there have been sponsors that have received designations on the basis of just the animal or in vitro studies alone. The clinical data that you submit can be very preliminary. You're simply showing that the drug might be effective. You're not proving efficacy at this point. You don't have to do big studies with lots of patients. I mean, that would be difficult to do anyway, often in these orphan populations. You don't even need safety studies at this point. Remember, this is just for the designation. It has nothing to do with what the requirements for the market approval would be, which will certainly be much more rigorous. And then, of course, the application must also contain your complete argument that demonstrates that less than 200,000 people in the United States are in the indicated population. And this is, arguably the most important element of the application. There's no sort of 505(b)(2) type of option here. What I mean by that is you can't simply reference somebody else's designation or approval. So you need to provide your own argument here with your own data support. Do your own analysis of the data that are out there and present that to the FDA. The specific contents of the application are listed in the CFR in section 316.20. And there are 8 parts, and FDA recommends that you number the sections in your application to match the numbering in the CFR. So don't get creative and kind of create your own outline and format. Instead, just follow what they've provided here for you. So the first part is a statement of request for designation indicating the specific rare disease for which the designation is being sought. The second part is simple. It's the contact information for the sponsor. You also want to provide the identification of the drug and its source if it's different from the sponsor. You then, in part 3, want a description of the rare diseases, proposed indication, and the reason why the therapy is needed. And then 4 is the scientific rationale for the use of the drug. So this should be a description of the drug. It would include the active moiety or the principal molecular structural features, sort of depending on what type of product you have. If you can provide the drug's physical and chemical properties, then you should include those as well. Sort of depends where you are in your development. And then you need a discussion of the scientific rationale to establish the medically plausible basis for the use of the drug for the rare disease or condition. So you want to include all the relevant data from your in vitro lab studies, your preclinical efficacy studies that are using an animal model for the human disease, and then you're also wanting to include the clinical experience with the drug, anything that's available to the sponsor. So really this should be all-inclusive. You want to present anything you can find, whether it's positive, negative, or inconclusive. The one thing you don't need to provide at this point are the animal tox studies. And then part 5 to this is if you're claiming clinical superiority to an already approved drug, then you're going to have to include the basis for that conclusion in this part 5. If you're not, then you can just leave it blank. It's not applicable. If you're claiming that the drug will be used by only a subset of patients from the broader indication, it's here in part 6 where you're going to have to provide that argument and demonstrate that the patients in the broader population would not be appropriate candidates for the drug. In part 7, you need to provide a summary of the regulatory status and marketing history of your product. So this should include activities that are occurring both inside of the United States and in other parts of the world. And then part 8, last but certainly not least, is where you need to provide the support for the conclusion that prevalence is fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. Your application can be provided in hard copy, in which case 2 copies need to be submitted, or you have the option of just submitting 1 CD with an electronic version of the application, but you also need to submit a hard copy of the cover letter along with the CD. And all of the applications should go directly to the Office of Orphan Products Development, addressed to the director at the address shown here on this slide. So a question that we get a lot is around the timing of the orphan designation request and wondering when exactly in development it makes most sense to submit that. And there are some things to consider when you're making that decision. When it comes down to it, you just need to have the designation submitted, not even actually approved, but just submitted before you get your NDA or BLA filed. So that's the requirement to get it in before the filing of the market application. But for some sponsors, it can be beneficial to have the designation earlier in the development process. This allows for more certainty when you're having discussions with potential partners or investors, so you have a better understanding of what it will take to get approval, or that you know that you have this orphan designation and you can sort of flaunt that, you know what your exclusivity would be if you get approval. And it also allows you to take advantage of some of those incentives that FDA offers that are most helpful during development, and that would be like the protocol assistance. One thing to note is that it's not even necessary to have an IND filed at the time you submit the orphan designation request, so you really could submit the request very early in your development as long as you have enough information to support the medical plausibility sort of aspect of the argument. It is important to realize that while the application process is confidential, once the designation is granted, then it becomes public. So it's published in an FDA database as well as the Federal Register. So that's something to consider. And multiple sponsors can hold orphan designations for the same drug for the same indication. But it's the first one who gets approval, they're the only one who will get market exclusivity and the tax credit. So once that designation becomes public, it's essentially a race to approval for all sponsors who are developing the drug. Given that development discussions with FDA are generally confidential, you may be wondering why they treat orphans differently. So normally when you're going to your pre-IND meetings, none of that information is public information. But really for orphans, it all comes down to what is better for the patient. So you have to remember the reason why this legislation exists. It's there because treatment for rare diseases were incredibly sparse without it. So creating this competition between sponsors speeds the whole development process, and ultimately it's seen as benefiting the patient in getting an approved drug on the market faster. So what happens after the submission goes in? First, it gets assigned a designation application number, and it gets logged into the OOPD database. At that time, they send out an acknowledgement letter to the sponsor, and it just simply lets you know that your application has been received. And then they'll begin reviewing the application, and they'll often do this in consult with the appropriate review division that might have more knowledge and familiarity with your proposed indication. Then the typical request review takes about 60 to 90 days. At the end of that time, you'll receive either a designation letter or a deficiency letter. The issuance of a deficiency letter is relatively new. You used to just either get a letter that would request additional information or just a denial that didn't provide you really any other details on why you were getting denied. If your request is denied, you have the opportunity to resubmit it as many times as you'd like up until you submit the marketing application. So that's the cutoff for when you can't submit anymore. And if you submit a number of times, if you kind of keep going back and forth and getting a deficiency letter, FDA might sort of realize that there's some fundamental misunderstanding of their expectations. And at that point, they could request a meeting just to talk through some of the issues with you. You're also welcome to reach out to the Office of Orphan Products with questions at any point along the way. If a deficiency letter is issued, you have 1 year to respond to it. Unless you request an extension, if you haven't responded within 1 year, your request for designation will be withdrawn. If you've been granted an orphan designation, so you get the designation letter, you're required then to submit an annual report within 14 months of designation, and then each year thereafter. And that annual report should update the agency on your status and your general progress. So that annual report submission should include just a brief overview of the progress you've made in your drug development. So this would include a review of your non-clinical and clinical studies, provide the status of each of those, whether it's planned, ongoing, completed, and then if available, you can provide a short summary of results. You also want to include a description of the investigational plan for the coming year. And this would be where you would bring up any anticipated difficulties that you think are going to come into place in your development, in your testing, in your marketing, just to make FDA sort of aware of those issues early on. And much of this information can actually be provided simply by cross-referencing your IND if you have one. And then the last thing you want to include in that annual report is to address any changes that could affect the orphan status of the product. So you've likely been in discussions with the review division about your indication and the right design of your clinical trials and all of that sort of thing. And so you may have actually revised your indication during the course of development, and the impact of this change should be discussed in the orphan drug annual report. Because depending on how much the indication has changed, it could impact your orphan status, and so you may need to submit an amendment to your orphan designation request. As I mentioned, FDA maintains a database of orphan drug designations and eventual approvals. So this slide shows just a screen capture of that database. The product name field can be searched on the basis of the generic name or trade name or even just part of the name. And then the designation field is for the indications, and that can be searched with just part of a word. If you're really just interested in seeing a complete list of all of the designations and approvals, you can just leave all of the fields blank or in the default settings, and then just click on the Run Search button, and then you'll have a full list there that you can review. As I already mentioned, there are some other regulatory agencies that have introduced orphan drug programs, and one of these is the European agency, the EMA. A joint application is actually available for sponsors who wish to apply for designations in both the United States and the EU. There's a common form, it's an FDA Form 3671, that can be completed and submitted to both agencies. It is important to note, however, that the form is not actually current with some of the revisions to the FDA application contents as they're listed in the CFR in that 316.20. So most notably, FDA no longer requires a statement of interest. So that portion of the joint application form can just be left blank for the United States. The prevalence threshold for the EU is slightly different from that of the United States, so this is something you'll have to think about if you're considering whether you could apply in both regions. So it's expressed as a rate rather than an absolute number. The threshold is fewer than 5 in every 10,000 people in the EU, so it's a rate based on the population of all of the member states of the EU. There are also more criteria that one must meet to get orphan designation in the EU. So the drug must be intended for the treatment, prevention, or diagnosis of a disease that is life-threatening or chronically debilitating, and that's a higher bar than what is set in the United States. Also, no satisfactory method of diagnosis, prevention, or treatment of the condition can be approved, or if there is something that's already approved, the new drug must be of significant benefit to those affected by the condition. So it's a little bit more stricter criteria to kind of get through the orphan designation process in the EU. The Japanese regulatory agency has also begun supporting orphan drugs, and this is based on the success of the U.S. program. Depending on the timing of the application, the submission is handled either by Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, or it could be handled by the Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Agency. So in Japan, the threshold is like the United States, it's expressed in absolute terms. And so there it needs to be fewer than 50,000 patients affected in all of Japan. You must also demonstrate there that there's a high medical need for the product, so just sort of that one additional element. I already talked a bit about the various incentives that come along with orphan designation and approval. While these are all attractive, there are some nuances that sponsors should be aware of. One of the most powerful incentives offered through the orphan drug program is the market exclusivity. So as I said, drugs with orphan designations that receive market approval are granted 7 years of exclusivity for the orphan indication, just for that indication. It's important to realize that other sponsors can seek approval of other indications, and those products can then be used off-label for the orphan indication. So because of this, there's less incentive to study approved drugs for orphan uses because it really increases the chances that a generic drug will come onto the market and be used off-label for the orphan indication. The one way to avoid this is to make changes, significant enough changes to like the dosage form or the strength of the approved product, and tailor it to be used for the orphan indication. One drug can hold multiple orphan designations and ultimately approvals for multiple indications. So each indication receives market exclusivity. So if another sponsor could identify a second orphan indication for a drug, and both NDAs could get approval with 7 years of exclusivity for essentially interchangeable products. As I mentioned already, a tax credit covering up to 50% of the clinical trial cost is offered. It can be applied to federal taxes incurred in the year prior to approval or any time in the following 20 years. However, this is only helpful to a company that is actually enjoying taxable income that needs to be offset. For some companies, especially startups, this may not occur any time in the short term. So granted, you do have 20 years to use the credit, but it's likely to be most useful early on, so it's just something to consider. The approval requirements are no different for orphan drugs than they are for other drugs. Overall, you must provide substantial evidence of safety and effectiveness. Of course, defining what is substantial is handled on a somewhat case-by-case basis, and the FDA has a lot of discretion in determining what data package is necessary for approval. Gathering substantial data can be pretty difficult to do, considering that there are significant hurdles associated with studying orphan drugs specifically. Because the patient populations are so small, you really can encounter a lot of difficulty in trying to recruit patients for your clinical studies. It also can make it really challenging to find clinical investigators who you would consider to be experts in their field, who are also experienced in clinical trials and the principles of good clinical practices. And it may be nearly impossible to find a research center that focuses on the disease of interest. And those are the types of selection criteria you would look for in clinical trial on a larger scale for a non-orphan indication, focusing in on research centers and people who are experts. It's just harder to find those people. The conditions being studied, the orphan indications, are often chronic, progressive, serious, life-limiting, and life-threatening diseases with unmet medical needs. And diseases like this, it only complicates clinical study design and conduct. Because these indications have traditionally not received a lot of attention, often there isn't really a go-to for your endpoints, for your clinical endpoints, for your outcome measures, tools, instruments, biomarkers. It's especially important in cases like this to have a good dialogue with the FDA to make sure that you have reached agreement on what the appropriate endpoints are, what the appropriate study design is. And this is why the protocol assistance benefit really does have a lot of value. Because of these hurdles, there's a need for flexibility in orphan drug development. Some of the areas of possible flexibility that can be negotiated with the FDA include smaller safety databases than would normally be required, limiting your dose ranging studies, so you're able to progress to phase 3 studies a little bit quicker, using a non-validated outcome measure or instrument, providing just one single pivotal efficacy and safety study rather than your traditional 2. You can run your studies without concurrent controls. In this case, you might be able to identify historical controls from the published literature, or you could do case record reviews. You may also be able to generate data to satisfy some of FDA's concerns entirely from a retrospective review of case studies. So all of these possible sort of quote-unquote shortcuts should be discussed with FDA at your milestone meetings or through the available protocol assistance benefit. Just whatever approach you take, you want to make sure the FDA agrees with it to avoid getting in a situation where you have to repeat any of your studies. The requirements for the amount of data necessary to support approval are, like I said, handled on a case-by-case basis. And you can see how different the requirements can be from one product to another. So here are 2 examples. The first one, carglumic acid, which treats a rare metabolic disorder. It was approved in 2010, and that was on the basis of just one single study. So the study was an open-label, historically controlled, retrospective case series of just 23 subjects. Now, in comparison, dalfampridine, which provides relief from multiple sclerosis symptoms, it was also approved in 2010, so this isn't sort of changing over time, but that data package included your more traditional 2 randomized placebo-controlled studies with a total of 540 subjects. The Orphan Drug Program is handled by the Office of Orphan Product Development. The office is housed within the Commissioner's Office. Included in the administration of the Orphan Drug Program are the designations, so that's where you submit your request for designation, the grants also, so the grant applications would go here, and also coordination with the reviewing divisions on any issues relating to the orphan drug process. So this is where the OOPD staff come in as advocates for the sponsor in your protocol assistance and discussions with the reviewing divisions. OOPD reports to the Office of Special Medical Programs within the Office of the Commissioner. So this slide shows the orphan drug structure within FDA. So you can see OOPD under the Office of the Commissioner, and then CDER also has a rare diseases group under the Office of New Drugs. The mission of the CDER Rare Disease Program is to support research, development, regulation, and approval of drugs and biologics for rare diseases. The program coordinates the development of CDER policy, procedures, and training for the review and approval of treatments for rare disease. They assist in the development and maintenance of good science for rare diseases. They work collaboratively with stakeholders for development of treatments for rare diseases. And they also serve as CDER's focal point to the rare disease drug development community on how best to interact with CDER. In addition to the drug and biologics orphan designations that we've been talking about, there's a similar program for medical devices, and it's called Humanitarian Use Devices. This program was established in 1990, and it's for devices intended to treat or diagnose diseases or conditions that affect fewer than 4,000 people in the United States per year. So the information that needs to be submitted in a humanitarian use device application is similar to what is submitted for drugs and biologics. So you have to provide data demonstrating that the population estimate is fewer than 4,000 per year. Again, this can be a subset of a broader population, but in that case, a rationale has to be provided explaining why the device isn't meant for use in the bigger population. The application should also contain a description of the rare disease and a description of the device and the scientific rationale for its use. Devices that receive the humanitarian use designation can then apply for marketing approval with a humanitarian device exemption application. So this application is similar to a PMA, a pre-market approval, but rather than submitting data in support of both safety and efficacy, with the humanitarian device exception, you can just provide information on the safety of the device, and you don't need to prove the efficacy of the device. One last program that I wanted to talk about today is an incentive available to sponsors with drugs that treat rare diseases, but specifically it's for rare pediatric diseases, and it's a priority review voucher program. So this program is modeled after the priority review voucher program that's awarded for drugs that treat neglected tropical diseases. So if you get a drug approved that treats one of these neglected tropical diseases, they'll then give you a voucher for priority review of another product. So the pediatric disease priority review voucher was established in 2012 as part of the FDA Safety and Information Act. And the purpose of it overall is to incentivize development of drugs for rare pediatric diseases. So you can earn a voucher by receiving approval of an NME, so a new molecular entity, that qualifies for orphan status for a disease that primarily affects individuals aged from birth to 18 years. The voucher is then used to guarantee you priority review. So this takes your review clock down from the normal 10 or 12 months, depending on whether your product is an NME, down to 6 months. So this is really a significant reduction in the amount of time that your application is under FDA review. So the obvious appeal here is that it allows a sponsor to get that first-to-market advantage. The vouchers can be sold from one company to another, and they can be used for any drug. It's not just for drugs that treat rare diseases. It's not just for drugs that warrant expedited review. It really can be used for anything at all that's in your pipeline. So you really could use this as a strategic opportunity to get your application in and approved ahead of another company who you might be racing sort of to approval. The priority review also comes with an additional fee, and the fee for 2014 for this year is $2,324,000. And this extra fee is on top of any other fee that would normally apply. So if you're already paying the full fee for an application that contains clinical data, you're already paying over $2 million to file your NDA, and then this would be on top of it. So you're paying well over $4 million to get your application reviewed. So far, no vouchers have been awarded. The program is still in a testing phase. The plan now is that once the first 3 vouchers are issued, they'll start a clock, and at the end of 1 year, they're not going to issue any more vouchers. So at that time, they're going to stop issuing the vouchers, and then the Government Accountability Office will come in and really assess the success of the program and determine whether or not they're going to continue it in the future.
Thanks, Marla. That concludes the webinar. We have a number of questions, and the first is, can a drug approved for a non-orphan indication be then approved for an orphan under the same NDA? Will it gain additional exclusivity?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, you can have a drug that's approved for both a non-orphan indication and an orphan indication, and you'll always get that exclusivity, the 7-year marketing exclusivity for the orphan indication. A good example of this would be Viagra, which was obviously originally approved for erectile dysfunction, which is not an orphan indication, but then it also received an orphan designation for pediatric pulmonary arterial hypertension. So that was, just one of its indications are orphan. And on top of that, too, one single drug can have multiple orphan designations and orphan indication approvals, and each sponsor will get the exclusivity for their specific indication. But obviously, if there are other indications that don't have any kind of market protection at that point, generics could come into the market against one of the other indicated products and be used off-label for the orphan indication. So that's something to think about too.
Okay, great. The next question is, how do I file my orphan drug to my existing IND?
The orphan designation process is sort of completely separate from your IND filing. So it's handled by the Office of Orphan Drugs. And there's a place, I think, on the 1571 that you'll submit with any IND submissions where you can list whether you have an orphan designation, and you can put your orphan designation number in there. But nothing is actually filed to the IND for the orphan drug designation. That request just goes straight to the Office of Orphan Drug Development. The other thing, too, to note is that you don't even actually have to have an IND at the time that you submit an orphan designation request. So you don't have to sort of have those linked in any way.
Okay, good. We have another one here, and the question is there an appeal function if the sponsor disagrees with a negative decision?
Yeah, essentially, your ability to resubmit your application is basically the way that you would appeal the decision. So FDA will issue a deficiency letter that sort of lists out the reasons for why they're denying your orphan drug designation request. And then you have a year to take a look at that letter and figure out how you can respond to it if you need to add, more data or find, some new literature to reference or something like that. If you don't get back to the FDA within a year of getting the deficiency letter, they're going to just consider it to be withdrawn. But you can go back and forth with them as many times as you want. I think I mentioned this already during the presentation. At some point, FDA might think, this has gone back and forth too many times. Maybe we just need to have a telecon or a meeting to kind of talk through some of these issues. And that will sort of be done on their behalf. But I think you could also probably request to get some advice and sort of converse with the people in the Orphan Drug Office to get a better understanding of how you could address the deficiencies.
Okay, great. I think we have time for a few more questions, and the next one is, for joint FDA-EMA review, will the decision for orphan designation be taken jointly?
No. So the joint sort of part of that, the FDA-EMA relationship is just in the application, so you can file just one application. It's the same application that you can file to both agencies. But requirements for orphan drug designation are a little bit different. For the FDA, it's sort of that absolute population estimate of less than 200,000 people, whereas in the European Union, it's based on the population, so it's less than 5 in 10,000. So the prevalence could differ a little bit in the two regions, and you're also focusing on the prevalence of the condition in that specific region. So for the FDA, they want to know how many people in the United States have that condition, not worldwide. So you won't necessarily qualify in both regions. Often people do. Often drugs will qualify in both places, but it's not a given. And the EMA also has some additional sort of requirements that have to do with the seriousness of the condition that you're treating, and also whether there are any other therapies on the market. And if there are, then the new one needs to provide some sort of benefit over what's already approved.
All right, thank you. Our next question is about submissions format. The person is wondering if you can elaborate more on the format. Should it be paper, CD, DVD, or both? And is it possible to do an e-submission?
Sure, yeah. FDA asked for 2 paper copies of the submission that go directly to the Office of Orphan Drug Development. But you could also submit a single CD that has an electronic version of the application, so all of your files would be on there electronically, and you just need one CD submitted. But you're also going to want to submit a hard copy of a cover letter along with that submission. So it doesn't go through the electronic gateway, so it's not necessarily an e-submission, but you do have sort of that ability to submit something just in electronic format. In Europe, you can submit, you have to submit 1 paper copy and also 2 electronic copies, so that you don't really have the choice between the paper or electronic over there.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, could an ODD be requested during review of an NDA?
No. So the cutoff for requesting your orphan designation is prior to the filing of an NDA or BLA. You don't have to have the approval in time for the NDA filing, so you could have submitted your designation request just right before you filed your NDA, but you have to have at least filed the designation request before the NDA went in.
Okay, great. Well, I think we are just about out of time, so I'll ask you one more question, and that is, once one applies for orphan status, how long does it take for review and approval?
Well, there aren't any sort of PDUFA review timelines associated with the orphan designation request process, but generally FDA will get back to you anywhere within like a 60 to 90-day window. Rarely do they take longer than 90 days to review the request.
Well, thank you so much, Marla, for your presentation and for your answers to these questions. It looks like we are out of time, and we do have a few remaining questions, which we will answer and email to you along with the slides within the next week. In addition, we would appreciate it if you could take a minute to fill out the evaluation survey on the left side of your screen, and we thank you all for enjoying the presentation.